Caste society is what happens when violence itself slips into the position of petite object A and ends up sort of structuring the entire subject of society itself. Is sort of my point. That's my point with caste society, and that's why I start with it in the state.
We've been talking. Let's see. We've been talking for just about 40 minutes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Are we going to do all the actual dictatorship of the proletariat in the parrot room?
Yeah.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Thomas Jones, you are a member of the DSA. You are a theorist. I think it says here that you're a software engineer, and you work both for a university and private companies. Is that right? Or you've done both?
I've done both. Right now, I'm actually unemployed.
Oh, okay. Well, we can cut that part out. Unless you want to put it in so that people will hire you. Some communist somewhere will hire you.
Yes.
So I'm going to read your bio from the magazine. Dr. Thomas Jones has worked as a software engineer in both industry and academia. He has been a socialist activist for the better part of a decade, starting his journey towards socialism at Occupy Wall Street. He is a previous member of Socialist Alternative and a current member of the Seattle DSA. So remind me what Socialist Alternative is and what kind of little sect or Marxist tendency that it is associated with.
Yes. So Socialist Alternative is a Trotskyist organization. They are associated with Shama Sawant, primarily in Seattle. So Trotskyist Democratic Centralist sort of organization with an international, also associated with the Committee for Workers International, CWI, at a international level. That's basically what Socialist Alternative was, at least when I was in the organization. I've not been in for a few years, so I don't know about any more recent political developments.
Okay. And you've written an essay for us, which I was looking at today. Again, you know what? There's some errors in here in terms of breaks between paragraphs. I'm going to go through and clean this up before. So anyone who goes to see this, based on this interview, you'll find a nicely cleaned up version of the essay. But the essay is entitled, let's see, I'll read, On the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. And I am really interested in diving in on this because I think having conversations about that phrase, I mean, we may want to drop the phrase in so much as it has a connotation that we don't want to hold on to, perhaps. But if I look beyond that connotation, I tend to be for the dictatorship of the proletariat as opposed to the dictatorship of capital. So I think it's worthwhile to explore different ideas around just what the dictatorship of the proletariat would be and what it means. So why don't I give you an opportunity to first of all, why don't you first of all just outline the main arguments in your essay? So
I think that you had Chris Catrone on previously. And he had read the article, which he was, in his words, not happy with. In my head, I have sort of the reason he gave was that there were lots of anthropological and psychological categories in the article that he didn't think had anything to do with the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in my head, I had this sort of image of a Frankenstein Catrone running through a dark village while villagers pelt him with copies of the Accretes, and he yells "Lacan bad" at them. And I can understand that perspective because he's saying that whatever communism is, it'll be a different psychology, but that's not really the important point. But the argument that I'm making is not necessarily about psychological categories, or if it is about a psychological category, it's about the psychology of society itself at a structural level, which is to say society as a subject. Or if you want to put it in a more theological terms, you would say the psychology of God himself in some sense, which is sort of the crazy, Zizek always talks about Hegel and how he has this crazy idea that he could know what God is thinking. And it's sort of an attempt to repeat that in some sense. And so when we're talking about a psychological category, we're really talking about a material category underneath everything. And this is where sort of my training as a computer scientist comes in, because as a computer scientist, I perceive, my training or understanding is that thoughts are material processes. And that the other way to think about material processes is that they are thoughts of some sort of bigger structure. And so there's a sort of transition back and forth between those two positions. And so when I'm making use of these psychological categories, as Catrone puts it, I'm really trying to make use of how does society reflect upon itself at a material level. And this is
I think you should we need to debate whether or not you're materialist during this conversation.
No,
I'm
that's
not going
fine.
to just let you grant yourself. By the way, also materialism. No. You're going to have to prove that.
I don't know much about physics, so I'm going to ask this simply, and maybe you already answered this. Do you reject the possibility of a non-physical reality interacting with this physical reality? And do you acknowledge the possibility of it through seeing the effects it might have on the physical reality? I'm thinking of the study of the smallest entities of an atom, and and also just the power of attraction. What is it?
Well, the two of us share something. I don't understand physics either, so we're in the same. And in fact, I don't think physicists understand it, and they're pretty open about it. But you see, you can't ask the question about interaction between physical and non-physical until you tell us what physical means. Okay, you've at least got to be able to tell us what physical means in order for the question to be answered. But there hasn't been any concept of physical for hundreds of years. There was one in the early scientific revolution, a very intuitive concept of the physical. That's what inspired Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, Lagrange, many others all throughout the modern history of science. But it's been recognized, but it was already recognized after Newton that it's gone, like Locke recognized it, Hume recognized it. For Hume, it's not only gone, it's a total mystery beyond our intellectual capacities. And that we can speculate about, but it's certainly gone. And no one has proposed anything else. The physical these days are things that Newton would have regarded as total absurdities, like curved space-time. How can that be physical? Quantum entanglement. I mean, Einstein regarded that as non-physical because it's so absurd. But now scientists just accept it. Physical is just anything we more or less understand. And if that's the only notion of physical we have, there can't be interaction between physical and non-physical. Non-physical will be all the things we don't understand. If we ever get to understand them, they'll be physical.
My evidence for this is that each of these psychological categories is homologous to a dialectical, to basically a dialectical logical moment. That what Lacan calls a split subject, which is often symbolized by like a dollar sign because it's a subject, but it's split. That corresponds to nothing. The petit object A that Zizek talks about, that corresponds to either false if you're in logic, or it corresponds to possibility is another, because anything that's false is also possible. Like that's merely false. Anything that's merely false is also possible. The S2 corresponds to knowledge in Lacan, but at a sort of logical or material level, it corresponds to false or true, like the tautological statement, false or true. So basically a list of everything, every possible state that you could be in. S1 is just true itself, true by itself, or basically what is it in tautology that is equivalent to the whole tautology, and in true or false, the thing that's equivalent to the whole statement is just true. And then you have this sort of reversal at the end where you say, well, what's the opposite of the tautology? Well, it's a contradiction, and that's a return back to nothing. Nothing is just a contradiction.
Okay, let's walk through that a little bit more slowly here. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So to begin with, we have the idea of the split subject,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that means that the way I understand that is that, well, I think of the beginning of the phenomenology when I think about the split subject. So I was having this conversation just yesterday with my 18-year-old son, who had seen my latest video and just said what you were talking about when it came to structures just didn't make any sense at all. And I'll tell you what it was. I had tried to summarize Derrida's critique of structuralism.
Mm-hmm.
And Derrida's critique of structuralism is that in any given structure, the transcendent signifier, or the center of the structure, the thing that gives it its coherence and meaning, is always both part of the structure and resides outside of it. So there's an arbitrary quality to the power of the way it structures all the particulars within it.
Yeah.
Right. So simple example is, okay, you have a structure that you conceive of as, let's say, a table or a chair, and the tableness is the concept that structures the thing, that gives the structure of the table its coherence. But when you try to discover just what that tableness is, it isn't contained within the actual empirical table in front of you. It's an abstract concept that's, from a positivist point of view, it's actually an analytics construct. It's like true by definition. It's tautological. And then the empirical fact of the table really none of the empirical facts of the table are going to contain its tableness. So the subject is it's split because when it encounters the world, it has to always account for its own imposition upon the world, its own its own responsibility for shaping the world. That analytic side is where the subject is that in the creation of concepts and the ordering of the world. And in fact, even the empirical side seems to arise from within the subject and is contained within the subject rather than really being exterior. So
in reality, the things that I see in the world, they're actually just images inside my brain. They're neural signals.
Right. I mean, I love going over that. It feels like a big, when I realized that many, many years ago when I was pretty young, I realized it in a variety of ways over time. I thought, oh, wow, this is the biggest thing in the world to realize, and I always feel like a genius when I think of that again and again. But I do, because it's an easy one to, we all are compelled to just completely overlook that fact. Like we but anyway, that's what the split subject is about. It's about how the world is both seemingly objective but also subjective, and in fact, the split is actually something that arises through time.
Well, it's a split between the subject and their symptom, and the subject is this sort of empty core at the center of the subject, and the symptom is all the particular images that are being fed into them.
Okay, well, we can get into the finer points on that, because I'm not sure I completely disagree that or agree. I'm Freudian slip. I'm not sure I completely agree that the split it is within the subject, but the subject then has to be reconceived as split.
Yeah,
and the analytic side or the conceptual side is what we normally would take up as a subject in a kind of Kantian move. And
though what I was originally talking about was how this is all materialist. And
Right.
that
Well,
this
okay,
is,
but let's keep going through the steps that you just laid out, because so I got the split subject. That's just the very, very start of what you said.
yeah.
Right. Right. Okay. So then now take me to remind my addled old brain what the next step was. It had to do with
So the next step is
knowledge.
No.
Right?
That's the step before after that. So the
Okay.
step before that is an analytic step, and the analytic step is you take nothing, you say something like, what is always definitionally true of nothing, of something that is the no thing, and that's that it's false. Like anything that is the no thing.
How are you led to consider nothing after you can? I mean, it's starting with sense certainty and then arriving at the split subject. How does
So these
arise?
are different orders of being. So these are homologous orders of being. And so here I'm dealing in logic. And so what I'm saying is that the nothing of the split subject is homologous to, or that the split subject is homologous to nothing itself, all the way down at the base of things. That basically, when Lacan says there is no subject, that's homologous to the very concept of nothingness itself on some level.
I thought he was an incel, and he said the woman doesn't exist.
he said lots of things. He said lots of things. Not everything. I mean, I speak Lacanese, and that's part of the reason why the article is in Lacanese.
Mhm.
But not everything that Lacan says is necessarily either to be taken directly or to be taken as.
It's not the same thing to say the subject is nothing as to say that the woman doesn't exist. It doesn't matter. I'm getting distracted.
It is the same thing in a sense, but specifically the context in which he's saying that is a mid 20th century context where the sexual split is mostly between male and female. That's mostly where it seems to reside. Whereas today, I would say that the sexual split has moved elsewhere. And so the woman may exist now, whereas she didn't exist in the mid 20th century.
I think that there are many, many people who want to hold on to that split.
Yes.
Right where it was. And
yes, there are.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they get to.
Right. All right. Fair enough. But I myself still feel that there is a primary split there between men and women. Certainly, that's how I experience the world. All right. So, all right. Moving on from that. So then there's so after the split subject, you have this. The consideration of what it is to be nothing. What is nothing conceptually, right?
Yep.
And say a little bit about that.
So what is nothing conceptually? Well, whatever nothing is, it's false. It's not going to appear in my perceptual field. It doesn't exist. It's a false thing. Whatever the no thing is. So if a table is nothing, then that means it doesn't exist. It's nothing. It's false. Same thing with any other sort of concrete object that you want to come up with. They're all anytime that they're nothing, they're false.
Okay.
And so we get the concept of false then as a sort of analytical object out of nothing. Mm-hmm. And right now we're dealing on the level of logic, not on the level of material exactly. So we're dealing with sort of these logical categories, but I can also do this on the material level after this if you would like.
Or an empirical level, you mean?
Or on an empirical level.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then we have false. Okay, great. We have false. Well, now you can take false and you can generalize it by turning it against itself and coming up with true or false.
Okay.
So you have false, but now you also have true as a possibility as well. So you have true.
How is that
false.
Generalizing it to turn it against itself?
Because basically generalization is you take this sort of primary analytic object, and generalization is what happens when it then sort of expands to fill up all of the available space by saying that I have one instance of it, which is false. And then using just the operations that I already have, I can start generating other instances of things like false. So true is like...
Have you generated nothing again to go back a step? How has nothing been
No, nothing is assumed. I'm just starting with nothing. Okay. So, yeah. So I'm going to buy nothing for free. Hopefully you'll let me do that. But from nothing, I get true or false.
Okay.
And then I have
this is like the opposite of the beginning of the phenomenology, because in the beginning of the phenomenology,
it starts with being.
It starts with being, with sense certainty. And then the same thing is true in the science of logic. It starts with pure being. And then through examining pure being, the immediately present, we arrive at nothing through that. And then we, because what Hegel does in the beginning of the Science of Logic is he says, let's imagine being in and of itself for itself, pure being, not a particular being, but universalized being, existence. That, and which is a fine thing to try to take on if you're a philosopher, because that is what ontology is about. That is the topic that looking for the substance, which is
and so
what it is to be.
This is sort of a Zizekian correction to this, is to say, but it's nothing that exists. Nothing is a thing. Is a object of study.
No, but you don't need a Zizekian correction to get to nothing from.
No. I mean, you could start from being if you want to, and then you just realize that being in itself is nothing.
Right, because what you realize, right, exactly. To be in the science of logic, it's like if you try to imagine pure being without any distinction, which you'd have to do, would not be limited. It would be universal, infinite, truly, universal. It would be the substance behind all appearances. And you try to imagine what it would be, you arrive at nothing. Yes. And, in a way, this is a restatement of the arguments of Bishop Berkeley, who said if you try to imagine matter as the universal substrate of all things that exist, and you take away all the perceptible qualities of any particular material thing, you are left with nothing. You are left with
you're left with the wibbly wobbly, which is the quantum mechanical wave in nothing behind everything.
Not according to Bishop Berkeley. You're left with nothing after you strip away all the perceptible qualities. Not with atoms, not with wibbly wobbly quantums, not with some whatever. You're left with nothing, with no.
Well, but so then my sort of retort would be that that whatever is waving behind quantum mechanics, that is the nothing. That's the nothing that's waving.
Well, you have to strip away waving, because waving is a particular.
Well, yeah. But the thing itself quality. Could be tranquil. It could be tranquil, and then that.
You have to strip away tranquil. Because no, I mean,
you have to strip away tranquil in space, and or really what I would say is that when you get all the way down to it at the very base, what you have is contradiction, and that's what's left.
Right, but Bishop Berkeley doesn't arrive at contradiction. I'm just restating Berkeley for the moment saying, okay, so Berkeley says you strip away all the perceptible qualities of a material object, and you do not have anything left to consider. This is a bishop talking, not Stephen Hawking's. And so in a way, Hegel is making a similar move, only he doesn't stop where Berkeley does. He says, but let's consider nothing.
Yes, let's consider nothing.
Right. And through a similar process, he comes to arrive at the fact that nothing to be considered would have to have a substantiality. It would have to have an existence.
And once you get through all the steps, the substantiality is contradiction. That what is nothing, it's exactly identical to contradiction.
That's where Hegel ends up. But Berkeley didn't, but Hegel ends up.
And Berkeley, at least from my opinion, is wrong. But
of course he is. Yeah, of course. The reason I refer to Berkeley is because he's simpler.
Do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
Now, hey, look, mister, it is you who make the claims. I bend spoons with psychic energy. I never claimed to be able to bend them with my hands. That is your claim.
Well, you certainly did bend it with your hands.
Yeah, well, yes, maybe the psychic energy does flow through my hands, yes. But the fact is that the spoon is bent.
Well, I can bend spoons with my hands.
I never claimed that my powers were unique. Always I stress that anybody can bend a spoon. And my book is not expensive, by the way.
If Berkeley stops at sort of nothing, like what's interesting is that there's a kind of, so this is where, like I say, the psychosis of anti-theory This is the psychosis of anti-theory. He has no petite object A to grab onto.
Well, he does. He just
or God.
God,
he inserts God. Yeah. And so, which of course is okay. So psychosis is either you have no petite object A or everything is your petite object A. And if everything is your petite object A, well, then that's God. So basically what he does is he just immediately reaches for God. And sort of shoves that in the position of false and says,
hardly surprised given he's Bishop Berkeley, but yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So, we're way away from the dictatorship of the proletariat.
We're way.
But I want to get to, so then you have so we've gone from nothing, we've stated and then kind of put to the side the fact that the subject is split. And now we're kind of describing how that is the case, right? And you started with nothing, I started with being, but we both arrive at the fact of the contradiction that even pure being or pure nothing brings forward, right?
Yes.
So now, then there's in a contradiction, you can also conceive of it as a matter of the difference between something being true or something being false. Yeah.
Well, so a contradiction is something being true and being false, which means it's something that almost exists. And so this is like the first sort of step where when people are like, well, what is a contradiction anyway? What does it mean when Marxists say contradiction, all this stuff? Well, a contradiction is materially stated, it's an oscillation. You're in one position and now you want to be in the other position. Oh, now you're in the other position. You want to be back in the first position. And so you go back and forth between them. But basically the point is that contradictions have an impact on material reality. And the reason they have an impact on material reality is because they almost exist. They don't exist. They never exist. It's never the case that you are going to encounter like a real actually existing contradiction in the sense of like, this is an object and it's a contradiction. Except that petite object A kind of is, because it's a partial object. It basically has like a non-contradictory image that it presents you. And then behind it, there's a bunch of contradictory nonsense that's going on that's sort of non-reality.
Yeah, that's how, if you're an empiricist like John Locke or Bishop Berkeley or David Hume, or if you're we'll just stay there, we could say a German idealist even, but certainly if you are an empiricist like Bishop Berkeley, that is how you conceive of, or John Locke, let's say, John Locke, that's how you conceive of the world for the most part. In fact, what you're trying to do with your John Locke is you're trying to find the aspects of empirical reality which are not partial. And by being partial, that means that are not subjective, but are fully objective. So like if you can encounter something that you can say, oh yeah, I'm encountering something as it is for itself and in it itself in the world, and not just how it is for me, then you're encountering an object that is not partial. You're not only seeing one side of the object. So for John Locke, it was, he counted a red apple, and the redness he thought was within his subjectivity.
And he was wrong about that because, of course, because redness, yes, it's a particular frequency, but the experience of redness is something that you only experience in sort of like in your eyes, and it gets changed based off of where you are in position to the universe and all this kind of stuff. So
right. I mean, well, right. But he believed that redness was completely in a subjective sense. And okay, the way it went in the history of philosophy was he said, no, the redness is in my subjectivity, but its extension and its mass, that's in the object itself. And the reason why was because he thought that it was our visual system and our brains that were taking data, which was one thing, light, frequency, waves, oscillations, whatever, and then turning it into an experience, which was another thing, which was an appearance that we'll call redness. And so since what we were experiencing when we experienced redness was this appearance, then that was subjective. But if you came across the mass of an object or the extension of an object, then those things were in the object itself. They weren't merely a matter of interpreting a light frequency or I think, I don't even know at what point the theory of vision changed from us sending light out and scanning things to receiving light instead. But
probably with Newton.
Yeah, that's right. So in any case, he perceived it to be in the object. But Berkeley and Hume and others came along and said, no, no, no. In fact, the mass and the extension and all that is also an appearance and not in and of the thing itself. And that's what Kant also picked up.
Which is true all the way until you get to symptom. Because once you have symptom, so basically the point is that whatever the thing in itself is, it's the symptom. It's the point where you can no longer mutate it because it just insists on continuing to be whatever it is. Would be sort of my response.
Can you give me an example of a symptom?
Well, this is difficult because thought is a symptom of the brain is kind of the problem. So basically, all that you experience is a symptom in some sense. Consciousness itself is a symptom, but I think that the easiest sort of way to think about it is that a symptom is something that is both my body and not my body. So if you have, say, cancer, let's say, and it causes you to have difficulty breathing. That difficulty breathing is a symptom because it is your body, your lungs, your breathing, the thing that you normally do easily. But now it's difficult. And now it's caused by this sort of thing that it's not a part of my body, but it is part of my body, which is the cancer. This thing that both is and isn't a part of my body. And so sort of the response I would say is that, and this is why what I'm doing is, or at least what I think I'm doing is materialist, is that I go along with yes, it's all subjective experience. Oh, wait, we hit the symptom. And once we hit the symptom, we've hit the thing itself.
Okay. So to go back to Berkeley for a moment, he was an immaterialist. He said there was no material world, but everything was a perception, and ultimately the perceptions of God. We're living within God's dream or something like that.
Well, for him, he just replaces a symptom with God.
Right, but they didn't. People at that time didn't have that conception. So, and the counter to him from Dr. Samuel Johnson was, all right, Bishop Berkeley, the world doesn't exist. Kick that stone. Break your
yes,
bones.
Yes, kick that stone. Oh, does it hurt? Does it hurt when you kicked it? That's the symptom.
Right. So, so the fact, another way to put it is, we're not living in a solipsistic universe of our own making. We're constantly coming up against resistances to our will.
Yes.
Whenever you try to pick up your car keys, say, and you miss and you drop them, there you go. There's your symptom.
Yes.
Because your intention and
Murphy's Law, in some sense, is the symptom. It's constantly appearing. It's like everything goes wrong at the wrong moment, that sort of thing. That's a symptom.
So this material world that resists your intention and your categories, where some part of it always goes awry, that is the symptom.
Yes.
All right. So we're on the same page.
We're on the same page there. Yes. Okay. And then, I mean, and if you want to make it like into a really sort of like basic materialist argument, because I can do this logic for quantum mechanics too, if you want to go through it.
Don't even start with quantum mechanics. I'll just try to make you define things and explain things on the level of quantum mechanics, and we'll spend the rest of the day.
Okay, we'll spend the rest of the day. Okay, so but to bring it back to the dictatorship of the proletariat. I'm not talking.
No, let's finish off the thing. So So we got to the true and false and the subject of knowledge. The knowledge is
true or false.
Okay, so when we're thinking about true and false as a contradiction,
true or false, it's an important distinction. Or versus and.
Oh, true or false.
Yes.
If something is true or false. So
it's a tautology.
Yeah. So you enter the world. But again, I'm going to stay on the level of you're encountering a perceptual object, an apple.
So what you're doing is
yourself, am I really encountering an object? Is this actually there?
So
if it has a symptom, then it's true. If it resists you, then it's true. But if you can make it levitate around the room with your mind, then maybe it's not there. Is that?
So basically, once we're at the level of true or false, we're going through and we're listing all the possibilities. So you're but what you're saying is basically right. It's that, I see an apple, but it could be a picture of an apple. It could be, some kind of
dreaming.
I could be dreaming. It could be a gremlin that looks like an apple, but it's, it could be a mimic like in D&D. It looks like an apple. I go to pick it up and it eats me. It could be, you go through all the various possibilities of what could this apple actually be. And so that's the subject of knowledge is when you're, and it's kind of, we've been going through this as a society on some level, this sort of neurotic obsessive. This is also, so once you get up into psychology, kick it up to psychology, it's neurotic obsession, where you have to go through and you absolutely insist on listing every single possibility. That's what's going on right there, is that you're going through true or false. So you're listing true, yes, hopefully there's true somewhere in there, but also all the various versions of false, just to make sure that you get true somewhere in your list.
I see an apple, I go up to it to pick it up, and I think it could be a gremlin, and I do something to test to see if it's a gremlin. Say I'm playing D&D.
Yes.
I cast a spell to test before I pick it up. Are you gremlin? No, that comes up negative. And then at that point, I might, if I wasn't neurotic, say, well, I'll pick it up. I'll take the risk. See if.
But if you're neurotic, you'd say, okay, but it's not a gremlin, but is it a mimic? Okay,
yeah, like is it a Rubik's Cube? Is it a ghost? Is it yes. a projection from the demonic underworld? Is it an illusion? Is it
actually an apple?
Is it a pear that someone shifted into being an apple? And you could spend the rest of the game, to everyone else's annoyance,
yes,
just casting spells on this apple. What about just a test like, is it an apple?
Yes.
So
the moment that you do that test, and that's the first test that you reach for, now you've passed into from generalization, where you're doing everything, into prohibition, where you're just saying, all I want to know about is what is true. And I'm going to go with what I think the best possible answer is, which is that it's an apple, actually. And so I just do the apple test first. Mm-hmm. And so that's prohibition. And what's prohibited here is to think contradiction. So when you reach for true, you're trying to go through and you're trying to, sort of find the structure of truth. But what you're not allowed to think about is that actually underneath everything, the answer is it's both an apple and not an apple. That there's some sense in which it is an apple and some sense in which it is not an apple. And what that sense is, I don't know, depends on the apple. But that sense does exist, and it exists in every single kind of object. And so when you just do the apple test, you're doing prohibition, but you haven't yet returned to nothing. You're still dealing with sensible objects. When you negate that truth and you step back out of tautology into contradiction, that's when you're in nothing again. And so there's a return. You start from nothing as just like, I don't know what nothing is. And then all the way through the process, you come back to nothing as a contradiction.
This would be for me even the basic ontological in the sense of how do we grasp reality, lesson of psychoanalysis. It's not that we have reality, we perceive reality the way it is, and then we take refuge in some pathological symptomatic formations. In order to be able to confront reality, we have to rely on some symptom. What would have been my symptom? It's consciously not exactly dirty, but an obscene dream, to do a conference accompagnato, with piano player behind. It would be quite funny to do this kind of by piano accompanied lecture. Not only would it render explicit, I don't know how to call it, the emotional, affective modality of my talk, but then I would interact with it, I would make ironic comments about piano, about my own symptom and so on. That would be the ideal talk, I think. And of course, at the end, the ultimate ideal of a wise guy, but I'm not that oriental, would be, for me, just to sit silently at the piano to do all. And then at the end, I would just tell to the public, you got the point.
So if you were playing D&D and you came across the apple and you're going to cast a spell, to stay at the level of prohibition, you would just say, I'm going to test to see if it's an apple,
mm-hmm.
right? And it comes back and
it says it's an apple.
It's like, yeah, it's an apple, but with that tone of voice, right?
And so,
yeah, it's an apple. Sure,
yeah.
It is. And then
mm-hmm.
if you're going to return to contradiction, you might cast a spell and say, what else is it?
Mm-hmm. And it turns out it's actually the god of a little group of gremlins, and if you eat it, they're going to kill you. And so it's not a gremlin, not really. It is an apple. It is just a sensible, normal, boring apple object, except it's somebody else's fetish.
Uh-huh.
And so now it's also a contradictory object.
Because it is an apple that you could eat, but it also is not an apple that
could
kill you. Right.
Yeah.
Not just an apple. Right. Okay. So now let me ask this: how important is the other subjectivity in this story? Could we have another way that it's not an apple? Like, for instance, you test and said it's not. It is an apple, but it's also a hybrid, and it's part orange. So
yeah. So I mean, any kind of sort of contradictory structure like that you want, you can have. I think that the important point is, though, that there's a kind of short circuit in reality, and this is where things get difficult. You're going to always immediately, as long as you stay in reality, you're always going to immediately want to jump back to petite object A, which is this sort of false thing, which is both a contradiction and not a contradiction. It's a contradiction in that behind everything, it's a contradiction, but in terms of the surface level, it's not. And the problem is that the contradiction is always going to be excluded completely from reality. And so that's the difficulty. So even when I talk about, it's actually the god of a bunch of gremlins and they're going to kill you, I'm saying, oh, well, no, it's become petite object A again in some sense. But you can see how it became both an apple and not an apple in the sense of, like, there is a kind of contradictory process that's going on behind things, a thing that almost exists that's sort of starting to impact the space of possible futures.
Okay, so it seems to me like when I say, oh, it turns out it's a hybrid, that when I would cast that test for apple, it would come back, no, it's more than that, or it's not quite that. Instead of whereas if what you're talking about is the way in which the concept of apple itself is incomplete.
Yes, and necessarily so, always.
Necessarily so. So that, like, the way that the test would go to get to this point, you would say, is that an apple? And you get the Socratic answer. Yes, but what is an apple?
Yes, actually, that's perfect. Yes, that is exactly the hysterical contradiction response would be, yes, but what is an apple? Yes.
Yeah, right. And so, all right. So I understand it now. So the, if we're going to, and then you said something interesting, which is when you understand the true and the false, the true or the false being dialectically connected, or being really is in every appearance, that you cannot get away from the true or the false in everything, that split. Then you have landed on the side of the truth. Then that is the truth.
So the truth in some sense is contradiction itself. That's the truth. Mm-hmm. The truth is that what's excluded from reality is contradiction. And I have another sort of vivid metaphor for this, that reality is like a chainmail. You have all of these, chain links that are connected up to each other. And in the middle of them, there are holes. And these holes are contradictions. And if you didn't have the holes and you just had a sheet of metal, it would just be a sheet of metal. It wouldn't move at all. But because you have these chain links, that have holes in them and that sort of loop through each other, you get something that acts like cloth. And that's contradiction. It's pulling all of these holes out of reality, and it causes reality to, get up and dance, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So, and what about knowledge?
And knowledge would just be the chain links. It would be this chain link and this chain link and this chain link and this chain link and this chain link. Whereas the concept of chain link itself would be S1, or prohibition, or chainmail. Everything is chainmail.
I feel like the number one thing that everyone is getting out of listening to us talk is how big and nerds we both are. Let's find a common ground, some way to communicate. Let's talk about D&D. Okay.
Okay, so we've hit rock bottom of D&D.
So now everybody, fine. It's good. I feel like it does help me understand the concept. So all right. So this is in the background. This conception of reality. Let's say this view of reality is in the background. And we've answered the first question that I had, which is, what is a contradiction?
Yeah.
Now, then the second thing you said that people want to avoid is a bad infinity. Can you tell me what a bad infinity or spurious infinity?
A spurious infinity. In my understanding of what a bad infinity is that Zizek talks about this difference between a circle and counting. So bad infinity is counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whereas a good infinity is a circle. You go 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0 back and forth. And the difficulty with capitalism, or what sort of creates that counting, the necessity of that counting is the distinction between the numbers. That one is different from 1,364,000, yada yada yada, and the distinction between the numbers means that what's happening is behind the scene, you're consuming something. You're eating through something. You're eating through like some kind of fuel of some kind. And so what's going on in capitalism is that you're eating through basically future human attention in some sense. That's the labor power of the working class in the future. And you get these harsh jig-jags where you basically have like, there's some sort of productive understanding that's achieved in the realm of theory in technology. It gets implemented, and then you implement it all the way, and then you realize that you can't use that to valorize capital, and then you have a collapse, and then you kind of do this kind of thing. And it's that sort of that sharp up and then the collapse, which ends up becoming the spurious or bad infinity of capitalism. And then also the fact that it expands over time. So you get line go up, basically. You get line go up, but also in like these jagged back and forth movements. That end up causing disasters. They end up causing, the last time that we had a sort of resetting of capital, we had the Great Depression, first World War I, then the Great Depression, then World War II. And so this is the kind of disaster that can occur in capitalism as capital tries to reset itself to a level that it fits with what the working class is willing and capable of, the kind of capital that the working class is willing and able to service. Because, of course, all of that capital has to be served somehow by some amount of labor. And so, to me, that's the spurious infinity of capitalism, or the bad infinity, as opposed to a good infinity where you would just have sort of like an oscillation back and forth, and the only thing that you'd be burning through would be like time itself, as in like now it's a year in the future and we can't go back in time.
Okay, so, I think in most of the time what I hear is about is not really bad infinity, but spurious. So false, fake.
Yeah.
And the consequences, good or bad, of the infinity. I mean, you went to like, economic crisis and capitalist destruction.
Well, so I guess so. Yeah,
that's bad infinity, but just on the purely conceptual level, there's an infinity. There's a kind of infinity where you're within a particular set,
a cycle,
right?
Like you're stuck between 0 and 1.
Right. Okay. In a spurious infinity, an infinity where, like, okay, I'll put it this way: I have an infinite supply of apples.
Okay. Yeah.
That is a fake infinity because I do not have an infinite supply of being. I do not have the infinite set of sets. I don't have the truly infinite. I have only
you don't have an limited
particular set of infinite infinity of a type or of a if you could have the infinity of whole numbers, right?
Yeah.
And that is also spurious infinity but if you have true infinity, then the circle is indicating that it kind of contains itself.
So the difference would be when you say you have an infinite supply of apples, there's two ways that you could have an infinite supply of apples. One is that you could have an actual infinite supply, which you don't have because it's fake. You can't actually reach infinitely for more apples. The other one is that you could have an apple tree, and then you eat an apple, and then the next year you go and grab an apple, and then eventually the apple tree dies, and then you plant the seed, and then you have another apple tree, and then you do that again sort of forever. And it still relies on a different spurious infinity, which is that you're relying on the sun to provide a constant supply of energy from outside. And this is kind of the difficulty, is that it's not possible to get a perfect good infinity unless you get to like to the subatomic level where you're talking about, well, this photon oscillates between, its positive and negative node forever until it hits something. That would be the real good infinity.
Right.
But
can a finite being have something infinite, even a spurious infinity?
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that the photon is the finite being that can have something infinite, by oscillating in space between sort of up position and down. I mean, it's vaguely speaking. Whereas everything else cannot have access to a true good infinity. It's always got something from outside coming in to impact it. Unless it's, or like an atom. An atom could have a true good infinity because it's got, electrons orbiting it, and that orbit is pretty close to a good true infinity. Or a proton by itself. And but you have to get really small like that to get the access to those true good infinities. Otherwise, mostly what happens is there's always a flow through things. And the question isn't about, can we get rid of the spurious infinity completely? It's, can we get closer to the good infinity? And so sort of my point is that capitalism wildly off in terms of whether or not it can get closer to that good infinity.
Well, I'm gonna I think I understand what you're saying, and rather than, I think I have a disagreement with you, I'm gonna state the disagreement just to illustrate what you're saying as opposed to what I was thinking. Mm-hmm. So what I was thinking was, even if you had something that was infinite, mm-hmm. it wouldn't be the kind of infinity that we're looking for when we're talking about in philosophy of the substance or the universal or the absolute. Mm-hmm. That only because in order for it to be the absolute, it would have to be not just one particular limited kind of infinity, mm-hmm. but actually all. It would be the all. It would be, and the infinite universal absolute.
Well,
and so you're saying no, you can have a true infinity that is close enough. That's this thing on the micro, it'd be really, really small. This infinity would be tiny, mm-hmm. almost nothing, right? But not nothing. It would be maybe less than nothing.
It'd be less than nothing. You'd be consuming a little bit of that. You can be consuming in your spurious infinity. You could be consuming a lot of apple or a little bit of apple per unit apple that you sort of represent in your space of presentation.
Yeah, but the whole thing about the apple example was that it was never going to be no amount of apples.
Yeah, and in some sense, that's also true. Like at some point, the universe will die, or at some point, everything will be an iron star, and then after that, the protons will decay, and that sort of thing. And so, but it does make a difference to say that I'm dealing on a timeline of a decade versus I'm dealing on a timeline of 1 trillion years. And so that's kind of what I'm. Which kind of infinity are you dealing with?
But I would want to say that you can have an absolute that is infinite in so much as that actually also contains the finite. In its totality, all the different kinds of finite.
Yeah, and I'm not disagreeing with you. And what I'm saying is it's that quantum mechanical thing. It's the photon, it's the oscillation of a photon, it's the oscillation of an electron, it's all those kind of little tiny oscillations. But once you start getting up to our scale, it does not seem to me that you can grab a hold of that oscillation and make yourself be able to grab a hold of it directly.
I feel like a lot of what's going on right now between us is that I am dealing strictly with philosophy, mm-hmm. and you're like throwing these things in from physics and the real world, and I'm just like, don't bother me with the facts. I only want to talk about.
Well, this is my claim to materialism.
But okay. So I also worry that people watching are going to be as lost as we are, or maybe even worse, a little more lost than we are in this conversation. So I want to get back to the political side of this. We've been talking. Let's see. We've been talking for just about 40 minutes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Are we going to do all the actual dictatorship of the proletariat in the parrot room?
Yeah. Yes. Aren't I awful? I am just awful. Everyone who wants to actually hear the real conversation will have to pay $5 a month to get access. But Tom and I will continue. We might even mention some. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.